right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Um, so as I mentioned, my name is Alyssa, and I am an education attorney with the Law Project of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. Just so everyone knows, this presentation is being recorded and will also be on Facebook Live. So if you want to go back and access the slides, they will be there and we can definitely send them out as well. My email is on this screen as well as at the end. So if you have follow-up questions or information, please feel free to reach out. All right, so first just wanted to give a little background. The Law Project was founded in 1997, and then the Youth Futures Mobile Legal Clinic launched in 2004. So the Law Project provides civil and some limited criminal legal services to families and youth experiencing homelessness. We work a lot with educational rights for students, access to public benefits for homeless youth, as well as identification documents and other legal needs that may come up. So now I'm going to go over some of the state and federal law that protects the rights of homeless students. In Illinois, I know some of you have a lot of knowledge about this. There might be some of you who don't, so I'm going to go through it and hopefully it'll be some good information kind of no matter how much you know starting this. So the overarching purpose of the state and federal laws concerning homeless students is to remove barriers to enrollment, attendance, retention, and success of homeless students. So there's a number of federal laws and state laws that provide those rights. So the McKinneyVento Homeless Assistance Act is the main federal legislation that protects the rights of homeless students. And then Illinois has state-specific laws that go into some more details. And then there's also regulatory guidance, non-regulatory guidance, and policies of individual school districts, as well as the Illinois State Board of Education that you can find on their website that talk about the rights of students. So I first just want to go over the definition briefly of children who are experiencing homelessness. So the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, it takes a different approach than some other federal laws do in terms of defining who counts as experiencing homelessness. It has a much broader definition. So it includes those who are living in emergency or transitional shelters. And then it also includes those sharing the housing of other persons due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. And I bolded this because this is disproportionately how families and youth and children experience homelessness. They are staying at relatives, their friends, they're couch surfing. And this can be a very difficult living situation for a lot of families. It can be overcrowded. It can have different stresses and different dynamics. And I think especially during COVID, it has been really hard for families who are living doubled up. And I think that there's a lot of vulnerability with those families and children. So the definition also includes those who are abandoned in hospitals, living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, and then it goes on to kind of list other very specific ways that people can be considered experiencing homelessness. And going back a slide, I also just wanted to emphasize that if a family or a student doesn't meet one of these specific definitions in the law, that still doesn't necessarily mean they don't qualify under McKinney-Vento. So the definition also includes those who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So maybe a family doesn't meet one of these specific definitions, but when you get more information about their living situation, it's not fixed, it's not regular, it's not adequate, then they can still be considered McKinney-Vento eligible. Then I also wanted to mention unaccompanied youth. So these are youth who, a child or a youth who is not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian and experiencing homelessness. And there we say youth, but there's no age requirement. And last year, Chicago, or the 2018-2019 school year, Chicago Public School identified over 1,600 unaccompanied homeless youth. And I wanted to mention that these individuals can enroll in school even without a guardian or with a parent present, because they might not have the ability to have that adult register them for school. And so they are able to enroll in school even without that. And that a lot of times they do need that extra support from liaisons and school personnel. So, one of the key rights in McKinney-Vento is immediate school enrollment. So, students should be enrolled in school even without the traditional documents that are typically required, like birth certificates, immunization records, past school transcripts. Um, and immediate enrollment means attending classes and participating fully in school activities. And this right does not change even with distance learning or remote learning. And so families, if they are McKinney-Vento eligible, they are able to be enrolled even without those documents. And that immediate really does mean immediate. We want to make sure kids are in school and not missing those valuable educational days and experiences. And so, they should be enrolled as soon as that family comes in seeking enrollment in the school. So removing barriers. So under McKinney-Vento, barriers must be removed that prevent students from receiving appropriate credit for full or partial coursework completed while attending a prior school. And I think this is particularly important in light of COVID because there might have been students who missed hours if there were issues with accessing technology or turning in the remote learning information or, all the other kind of stressors. So schools should be working with students experiencing homelessness to make sure that they can get those credits that they need. And then I also mentioned on this slide that there should be specific outreach to seniors experiencing homelessness to make sure they're on track to graduate and to address concerns regarding college accessibility. So unaccompanied homeless youth are able to apply for financial aid for FAFSA as independent students, meaning they don't need to have their parents' information on the FAFSA. And this can be really crucial for a student to be able to access and attend college. And so making sure that, someone is reaching out to that individual and helping them if they have questions with that application and knowing kind of the rights of how they can apply. So choice of schools. So under McKinney-Vento, a homeless child must be allowed to enroll in at least three of the following schools. So the first is the school that the child or youth attended when permanently housed, or the school in which the child or youth was last enrolled. Both of these definitions we call the school of origin. And what this allows for is school consistency. So if a homeless child or youth, they often can be very transient and moving around to different locations, and we want to make sure that they have that consistency. And this is also really important even with remote learning, having that consistency of the same teacher and peers, even if it is virtual, can be really important and vital to a child's educational experiences. And so both of those can be the schools that the child can have a right to stay. And then a child is also allowed to attend the school that non-homeless children who live in the same attendance area in which the homeless child or youth lives are eligible to attend. So this is the local attendance area school. And one thing that's really important is that this is really the family's choice, what they think is best for their child and for their family. And I think, that can be a conversation with the school, but making sure that the family is really deciding, which option makes the most sense for them. So transportation services. So under McKinney-Vento, children who are experiencing homelessness, they have a right to have transportation to and from their school of origin. And this is really important because transportation can be a huge barrier for students to be able to access school. And this extends also to school-related activities, And then I also included that transportation needs to be provided if lack of transportation is a barrier to attendance, enrollment, and success in school. So as I stated earlier in the presentation, the overarching purpose of McKinney-Vento and other laws that protect homeless students is to remove those barriers to attendance, enrollment, and success in school. So if transportation, even if they're attending their local neighborhood school, but if transportation is creating that barrier, then that's something that needs to be looked at and provided. And I think one thing that's important that I want to mention here is during COVID, obviously, if the school is accessing using remote learning, they might not be transporting children to and from school. But I think it's important with messaging to let families know that McKinney-Vento provides a lot more services than just transportation. But also that, when in-classroom learning begins, that transportation will be provided again. And I think also using transportation services to assist families with getting remote learning tools that they may need is also something that is important. So this is specific to Chicago Public Schools, but they also have what's called Hardship Transportation. So in Chicago Public Schools, they typically give out bus passes for children and adults to get to school when the child's under 6th grade. But if for some reason the parent or child can't access public transportation, maybe it's a physical limitation or a timing issue with work, they can apply for hardship transportation, which would be door to door. And that's definitely something, if you have questions about it, you can reach out to me after the presentation. So also, there's no time limit for how long a child or family may be considered homeless. So there's nothing in the Chicago Public School Policy in Illinois or federal law. And I think this is really important because especially during this pandemic, I think accessing housing and work can be really challenging. And it might mean that a family is in a doubled up situation for a long time, or is, between different shelters or different locations and has a hard time getting out of that. And so, I think sometimes it can be easy for us to think that there's a limit for how long a family should be considered homeless, but there isn't. And the Illinois Education for Homeless Children Act, it does say that school districts can conduct a review of eligibility in cases where a child is doubled up at the same location for more than 18 months. So this is called an 18-month review. And basically it goes back to that definition of homeless. Is the living situation adequate? Is it consistent? Is it, does it feel like it's temporary? There's a type of things they can look into, but again, there's no specific timeline. So with all those rights that I went through, that is under McKinney-Vento, so the right to immediate enrollment, the right to transportation, the right to kind of support and assistance with tutoring or credit recovery. There can be disagreements between the school or the family. And it can be that the school maybe doesn't agree that the family meets the definition or doesn't agree with some other part, or it might be that the family feels like the school isn't, doing what they're entitled to. McKinney-Vento does require every state to have a dispute resolution process. And what I wanted to specifically mention here is that students who are homeless must be immediately enrolled in and transported to school until final resolution of the dispute. So if a school does bring a dispute, those rights under McKinney-Vento still apply to the child. So this is the same whether it's remote or in classroom learning. And so making sure that that child stays enrolled and connected all the way through is really important. So I want to talk about school fee waivers. So under federal and state law, all homeless students are automatically eligible for fee waivers, regardless of their family's income. And The way this kind of works is that students who are experiencing homelessness are eligible for the federal free meals program, and those students who qualify for the federal free meals program are categorically eligible to have their school fees waived. And this applies also, I wanted to mention, to low income students can also be eligible for fee waivers. So basically it comes down to whether your income meets the federal guidelines. So this can include students who maybe are at risk of homelessness or who are low income. So with a lot of schools doing remote learning, school fee waivers or issues around school fee waivers haven't come up as much, but I think as schools start to do more in classroom learning, one thing that school fee waivers does come that we get a lot of questions about is it does cover graduation fees. So fees for like caps and gowns, those get waived. And things that are kind of required by the school are going to be things that get waived. So things that are required for certain classes, for certain extracurricular activities like sports, are going to be things that get waived for students. And there's a list in the school code that talks about what things explicitly get waived and what don't. And I also too wanted to mention that there can be no punishment for families or students who can't afford fees. So there can be no kind of denying a child services or denying them the ability to register or enroll in school because of past due fees. And I think that's really important in light of COVID because we don't want children missing those educational experiences, and with issues around, getting computers or Wi-Fi, making sure that still happens quickly, even if there are past fees that are due. So now I wanted to go into some specifics around supporting families experiencing homelessness during the pandemic. So we all know COVID-19 has caused, job loss, health complications, and unstable housing, leaving many more families and children homeless or at risk of homelessness. And I think this time has been traumatic and difficult for everyone, but I think particularly families who don't have homes or a safe place to be, that's caused a particular amount of trauma and has been really difficult for homeless families. So some eviction prevention measures have been put in place statewide to protect families, but those measures might be time bound. We don't know exactly the permanency of them. This may result in dramatically increased numbers of evictions in the state later on, which could leave a lot more families homeless, on the verge of homelessness. And so it means a lot more families are expected to be eligible for McKinneyVento services during the school year. And I think it could be a lot of families who also maybe never were McKinneyVento eligible, and so therefore maybe don't know much about the program or know kind of who qualifies. So that sort of brings us to the role of McKinneyVento liaison. So every public school in Chicago and every public school district in Illinois has a designated liaison who assists homeless children and youth with enrollment in school and resources to attend and succeed in school. And liaisons and school staff in general play a really crucial role in sensitively identifying students experiencing homelessness. And that's really vital during this time that students are identified. A lot of families don't know that they meet the definition of being McKinneyVento eligible, and a lot of families might not kind of place themselves in that definition, and so their children aren't getting the assistance that they need. And so it's really important that those families are provided the information and are given the ability to have that identification. And that's, I think, where liaisons and school staff play a huge role. I also just wanted to mention, I know there's a few questions, and when I finish the presentation is when I will answer them. So if you have any, please feel free to put them in the chat, and then we'll have time to go through them. So the Illinois State Board of Education reported that public schools identified over 49,000 homeless students in Illinois during the 2019-2020 school year. Just for comparison, I put that's the capacity for Wrigley Field is around 41,000 where the Cubs play. So we have that is a big number, and a couple things around this number. So one, it's just the students who are identified and reported, which means we know there's some students who don't get identified. And second, this is a decrease from last school year. And with remote learning, it's really hard to identify students. You don't have that kind of relationship or interaction of being in the school building and seeing families and students. So we know that less students are getting identified. At the same time, it seems like there might be more families who are experiencing homelessness, which is why identification is so vital. And then Chicago Public Schools identified over 13,000 homeless students during the 2019-2020 school year. And this is a 15% decrease from the previous year. So again, it's really hard to identify families and students when you're not in the classroom setting. And so that, is why there's such a big role for school staff and for liaisons to do that. So I'm going to go over now some tips for identification during this time. So as I said, it's so critical to identify students and get them connected to the resources they need. So we worked, myself as well as a group of parents with lived experience of homelessness, and some other educational advocates worked on this document with the Illinois State Board of Education to provide some guidance for liaisons and school districts on how to support homeless students. So this is the website of where it can be found, and it's called Supporting Homeless Students During the 2021 School Year, Guidance for Schools and Districts. And the document, as I mentioned, it provides guidance to schools and districts on how to best support students experiencing homelessness during this time. And, all the rights and resources I mentioned earlier in the presentation have not changed in light of COVID or remote learning, but I think that there are some extra supports and nuances that need to be applied in order to really support homeless students. So a huge one is communication with family. We know communication has been really difficult without having that school building as a central location. So, schools need to use sort of every available means of communication and a variation of communication to really reach homeless families. So phone calls, emails, mail, school district websites, social media accounts, and appropriate and safe in-person visits. To provide that information about McKinneyVento to students and families. So, there might be some families who have a mobile device, but they don't have data. And so, maybe they can check their emails, but they can't get phone calls. And so making sure you're sending those emails so they can check it. On the other hand, maybe there's a family who doesn't have email. So having phone calls, having mails, having a really wide variety of ways families can get that information. Then contact information. So contact information is such an important part of connecting with families, especially during this time. So, making sure that schools are consistently collecting and updating contact information for McKinneyVento families and students. So this can include, current address, phone numbers, alternative phone numbers, email addresses, and emergency contact information. And this is a great thing that, can be on registration forms, can be on kind of just emergency contact forms, but making sure you kind of have multiple ways and means to get a hold of families, and reaching out to families and students to update this information monthly. So consistently updating it as phone numbers change, locations change, situations change, making sure that information is up to date. And I think that was, a big hurdle that we heard about in Chicago public schools when the remote learning kind of initially began, is that there was an issue with a lot of the contact information not being up to date for families, and that making it really difficult to get a hold of them. And liaisons should inform all students and families orally and in writing about the rights and resources for students eligible for McKinney-Vento services. So, as I mentioned, there might be a lot more families who are newly in situations that make them McKinney-Vento eligible. So making sure that those, kind of all families are given this information so that they can know and kind of be able to, ask for assistance if they need it from the school. So this slide talks about being trauma informed. So as I mentioned, a lot of homeless families have experienced a lot of trauma during this time. Homelessness in and of itself is traumatic. So it's really important that schools adopt sensitive and discrete protocols for identifying students and families. This can be on registration forms, on enrollment forms, and asking questions in such a way that is trauma informed and isn't triggering, so that the school can really learn about barriers and supplies that families might need. So as I mentioned, having those trauma informed questions on registration forms is really important regarding a student's living situation. And that information can then be shared with liaisons, and follow-ups can be scheduled with students and families. I also included a link to a McKinney-Vento toolkit for liaison that the National Coalition for Homeless Education put out that can be really helpful to look at. So this one talks about screening for families. So a good practice is to have questionnaires, have surveys, forms provided to all families in the district about questions regarding McKinney-Vento services and eligibility and living situations. And the form should include kind of a way for families to request those McKinney-Vento services. So they can get a hold of the liaison and have a way that if they had questions, they would know who to contact on those surveys or questionnaires that are being sent to families. So then outreach. As I've said a couple of times now, a lot of families might not know that they're McKinney-Vento eligible, or they might not know what that program is. So outreach is really crucial, and especially during this time when we're not in school buildings. So outreach about McKinney-Vento eligibility should be included in all school or district outreach or communication efforts. And we listed some examples. So food pickup or delivery, mailing of learning packets, back to school communication or events, emails, other communications to all parents and families, automated calling on the school district website, traditional or social media communication. So making sure that information is really out there to all families and students. And then posting notice of educational rights. So posters and outreach, both in, community places and places where families and youth experiencing homelessness might get services from, in school buildings and district offices as well is really important. And making sure they're provided in the languages of families and students in the community. So, getting in contact with your local hospitals can be really great to have posters put up. Grocery stores, laundromats, different places that families might still be able to see and get that information. And information on McKinney-Vento eligibility services and how to access it should be distributed widely to community partners and to service providers. That community collaboration, I think, is more vital now than ever. working with the different areas that serve families like the Boys and Girls Clubs, shelters, community centers, places that are going to have support for communities, having that information and reaching out to them even too about them reaching out to their community. So maybe if they're closed, but having that a digital flyer or information that they can email out to their contacts. Really just increasing that reach, I think, is really important. And then tips for identifying preschool students. So liaisons and school staff should inquire if McKinneyVento eligible families they're working with have preschool age children and working to connect them with preschool programming. I think that's a really great way to support families, make sure that, they're getting connected to those early learning programs. And that's the same too with McKinneyVento eligible families may qualify for birth to 3 programs. And I think that's really important during this time. So then access to technology. I think during this pandemic, it's really made light of the technological gap in access to computers and Wi-Fi and how important that is to students' educational experiences. All students experiencing homelessness should have access to computing devices and Wi-Fi. That same level of educational support needs to be given to them as other students. And transportation or delivery of the technology should be provided to families who can't, access it, and trying to do that with minimal delay so students aren't missing school. And I think also reaching out to families that are eligible for McKinneyVento services and asking what the barriers are. Families who are staying at shelters might have a really difficult time getting a place their student can, quietly access school, or maybe their Wi-Fi crashes a lot because now, they have a lot of students who are accessing it. Or maybe, the caretaker isn't comfortable with technology. So asking those questions, reaching out, figuring out what those barriers are, being, developing that relationship with those families, even if it's virtual, to make sure those students are really able to connect to that learning. And I think too, even when schools go back to in-classroom settings, again, asking families what barriers exist for students accessing in-classroom learning, and kind of getting that information. So food, I think a lot of schools have done an amazing job providing food to eligible families, and so making sure that continues. Whether the school is remote or blended, to make sure families and students have access to the nutrition they need, and having that food delivered or transportation given to families who can't get to the food site. And then access to personal protective equipment. I think like other tools that students need to access school, having that protective equipment is really vital, and homeless students might not have the same level of access to it as other students. So making sure that schools are providing, face coverings, hand sanitizers, and other things they need to keep students and teachers safe. And I think too, one thing we've heard a lot from parents is they have a lot of fear of increased punitive measures for their students. I think going back to in-classroom learning is going to be a big transition for a lot of students, especially homeless students who maybe faced extra levels of food insecurity or trauma. And so, I think making sure that there is plans in place in the school, that there isn't increased punitive measures for students who maybe struggle to follow all these now kind of brand new rules about wearing masks or hand sanitizers or distance, and thinking about positive ways to reinforce that safety is really important. So I just wanted to briefly kind of go over Chicago Public Schools reopening. So this is the schedule that's been posted as of January, a little bit before January 13th, but this is up to date. As we know, things change a lot. So in-person In-person learning did resume for students enrolled in pre-K and moderate intensive cluster programs. So staff returns for grades K through 8th around January 25th, and February 1st right now is the plan for in-person learning to resume with a hybrid model for students in grades K through 8. And here's some information about reopening. So parents have the option to opt out at any time from having their children attend in-person learning. For parents who do opt in for in-classroom learning, their children will be learning in pods for part of the week. So for 2 days a week, they'll be with the same pod of students in order to try to increase safety. Schools have been sent bus cards for families and students enrolled in the STLS program who need that transportation. And it'll be 7-day passes for parents with children 6th grade and under, and 2-day passes for children. And the reason for this is children will be attending 2 days a week, but if you have children in different schools, you might have different days. So that's why it's 7-day passes for parents. And one thing too, we talked to the STLS program at CPS, and they did say that if a parent has a hard time getting bus passes to their child's school, they can pick up bus cards at like the closest school to them. And that's something they can reach out to the liaison about. And also feel free to contact me if you're having trouble navigating that. CPS will have a daily health screener that all students and staff will need to pass to be able to attend the school in person. So it can be completed online or at the school, and it opens at 5 a.m. So making sure parents are really aware of this so they don't send their kids to school and then the school, the child doesn't pass the health screener and then can't attend school. So again, this is just a little information about the law project. We assist, as I mentioned earlier, we assist families and youth experiencing homelessness with enrollment in school, access to transportation, fee waivers, medical insurance, food stamps, other public benefits, and identification documents. This is our general number and our website. And this is our information on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And we do send out updates. So you can look at that if there are things around Chicago Public Schools or different things that are happening. And this is my direct number and my email. If you have any questions or concerns, definitely feel free to reach out to me. And as I mentioned, this PowerPoint can be shared, and this webinar is being recorded. So now I'm going to go over some of the questions with the last kind of time that we have. And I think Claire is going to read them and then I can answer them.
Yeah, so Karen asked if a youth is placed at a shelter due to a lockout situation and DCFS is involved, does the student fall under the McKinney-Vento Act or do they fall under DCFS Youth in Care?
That is a great question. So it kind of depends on the specific situation, but if they are in a shelter, they could still be considered under McKinney-Vento if they've actually spent time in a homeless shelter. But also a lot of the same rights that homeless students have, students who are in care have as well. So I think irregardless, it would be good to, the liaison can definitely provide kind of some of that information to the student. But the student would qualify for McKinney-Vento if they have spent time in a homeless shelter.
Nancy asked, does immediate enrollment mean their neighborhood school?
Yes. So the right to immediate enrollment counts for both their school of origin and the local neighborhood school. So whichever school the family goes to and decides to enroll in, they should be immediately enrolled.
Norma asked about a family that's been at the same address for 2 to 3 years, but they're in danger of being evicted and their power has been turned off. Are they considered McKinney-Vento right now? And do they qualify for services through McKinney-Vento?
So I think this would be a situation that would be really fact specific. So if they're staying in their apartment, their living situation, they're about to be evicted, they wouldn't be considered homeless just because they are about to be evicted. However, as you mentioned, like their power's been turned off. So if their living situation is not adequate, if they don't have running water, their power's off, or it's not stable and it feels really temporary, I think you can make an argument that they could qualify for McKinney-Vento. Just because a family's at risk of homelessness doesn't mean that they are experiencing homelessness now. But I think you would really have to kind of look at what their living situation is currently and if that is an adequate, fixed, and regular um, place that the children and family are living at.
Okay. And Eva asked, after we did our school presentation for staff, our teachers wanted to know the names of the students that qualify for STLS because they wanted to provide extensions and be more lenient for them this year. What is the process for releasing that information in general to homeroom teachers and in the situation for support purposes?
That is a good question. So I actually think that would be something to talk to the STLS department at CPS about. So Claire Bowman would be the person that I would reach out to at CPS. And if you don't have her contact information, if you reach out to me, I can definitely make sure you get that. And I think she could provide more information about that specific process.
Berta asked, where would I get the federal tax ID number when filling out the request for a free birth record? Or is that something we do not have to fill out?
Oh, that is a good question. So if you, as a McKinney-Vento liaison, if you fill out that portion of it, you shouldn't have to have the ID from the school on that, because that should automatically count.
Kimberly asked, does CPS have any community housing resource partners to address the issue of homelessness?
So I know CPS has recently has funding from the Crown Foundation to have these new housing navigator positions. I'm not sure if I think they're still in the process of hiring those, but I think that would be a good resource. And CPS does have a resource page that has a lot of that information. I don't know their specific kind of connections they have. But I think if you go on their resource page, there is some information about kind of what some of those housing resources are.
We received another question. Several students have told me they live with other family members or go from house to house, but the parents don't admit to being homeless. Can I still enroll them in the STLS program?
That's a good question. So if the child is with their parents, I think you need to have that parental consent. If it's an unaccompanied youth, so if the child is moving house to house and they're not really they're not in the physical custody of their parents, that decision can be made from the youth. But I think that's where, providing that information on McKinney-Vento eligibility is really important, and using that language. So maybe instead of using the language of, homelessness, using the language of being McKinney-Vento eligible, having transitional housing, and really explaining all the benefits and all the resources that a family can get from enrolling in the program might be a good way to approach that, and really communicating like this is just an extra protection for your child. Here are the things that can be, assist them with accessing school. And I think also explaining like that being McKinney-Vento eligible doesn't trigger DCFS involvement. It doesn't, it's not something that's going to be widely shared. I think can be kind of the best way to approach that.
It says, we love our STLS family, but wanted to double check on how many times a month we should be touching base with our families, weekly, monthly.
That's a good question. So, I think it kind of depends on your relationship with the family. I would say at least monthly to have some touch point, just to make sure that kind of, their information is up to date and that you can get a hold of them. And I would say at least monthly. And then I would also kind of say, you can think about maybe different ways. So maybe more, direct phone calls can maybe happen, monthly, but maybe you have some type of, email or newsletter that can go a little more frequently. And then I think it too probably depends on, how the student is doing. Are they, engaging in class? Are they, logging in? Does it seem like they're doing okay? Or are there families where it seems like, their child isn't being able to really access school, then maybe communicating and reaching out to them more frequently is helpful. And I think also asking the family, asking, can I consistently check in with you? Does it make more sense to have that check in happen monthly or weekly, or what kind of makes sense with them and developing that relationship? So they know that that you're really looking out for what they need, and what kind of makes sense for them.
We got a couple questions about college students, asking if McKinneyVento is applicable for college students, or if there are resources for families in temporary living situations trying to enroll in college, or 12th graders transitioning to college, or parents of a current STLS student.
Yeah, so McKinney-Vento does not go into college. It covers pre-K through high school. Um, but I think some really important resources, like I mentioned, is making sure, if they are McKinney-Vento and an unaccompanied youth, that they can file for financial aid as independent students. Some colleges do have kind of, resources that student support, that can, help students navigate. And then, in Illinois right now, we are trying to work on a bill called the College Access Bill, which would, require schools to have a point person to assist with um, homeless students. So I think it is kind of college dependent right now. Not everyone's going to have the same, but I do think there are resources that are kind of school specific, and that's definitely something. If there is a specific school or student, that you can reach out to me, and I can definitely help you kind of navigate some of those resources.
Then we got a couple questions about transportation. Are pre-K and kindergarten parents eligible for transportation? And when were the bus cards sent to schools?
Yes. So kindergarten students, 100% yes. They are eligible for transportation if they are attending a public school, just like any other STLS student. And for pre-K, if it's their school of origin, then yes, and they're attending a Chicago public school preschool, they are allowed to have, or they are provided transportation. If it is not their school of origin, they still could be provided transportation if it's creating a barrier for them accessing. But it's a little more dependent on the school program. And then if it is a community-based preschool, then it is going to be dependent on that individual program.
And then there was the question about when bus cards were sent to schools. And then someone else also asked, how do you apply for bus transportation when school resumes?
That is a good question. So I don't know exactly when they were sent, but I believe it was fairly recently. And again, that's something Claire Bowman at CPS would have the specific answer for. But I know it was fairly recently, so in the past couple weeks. And the process to request it for the family would be to fill out the STLS paperwork. So Chicago Public Schools has an STLS paperwork that you can request to fill out and request that transportation. And then usually each school kind of has their own process for distributing the cards. And if you're for the school requesting the bus cards to give out, that would be something that, again, they would reach out to the CPS STLS department for.
Someone asked if 8th grade graduation trips get waived.
So I would say yes, they should be waived, as they are kind of I would say a part of that graduation and part of that kind of vital experience for students.
And are there any trainings on helping our students fill out FAFSA?
That is a good question. I'm not sure if there are specific trainings for helping that, but I can definitely look into that. And if you want to reach out to me, you definitely can, because I'm sure there is some out there, and I could look into that.
I think we just had one more question asking you to explain in more detail about identifying homeless students via school district websites and social media.
Yeah, so I think one way those tools can be used is to, one, make it really clear and obvious who the liaison is. So I think a lot of families might not know who to contact at the school. And so I think putting on the website, if you are experiencing housing insecurity, if you're having difficulties, like here's the email contact or the phone number, or having a link on the website where they can shoot, an email to the liaison and the liaison will follow up, I think can be really helpful. And I think too, including on the website in a really clear way what McKinneyVento is, and some of the information about what the rights are, and who can qualify, I think can help families realize that they might qualify. And I think the same with social media. So, sharing information about McKinneyVento on the school social media page, sharing information about what to do if you find yourself in a transitional housing situation or being evicted, who you can reach out to at the school, I think can play a really big role in getting that information to families and helping them get connected and identified.
And did you share Claire Bowman's response to the question about whether you can share whether a student is part of the STLS program with teachers? She said,
oh, did she send a response?
Yeah, she said, best practice for sharing STLS status with other staff is to determine, is it in the student's best interest to share their STLS status, and does the student or family consent to their STLS status being shared? I think that was it for all the questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for being part of this presentation. We shared it on Facebook Live and Zoom to hopefully be able to access more people. So we're going